Hello everyone and welcome to the 4-4 review video where we're going to talk about two readings, Human Rights for the 21st Century, as well as Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place. And this is a unit, a module that really wraps up for us ways of reading sustainability. And I'm going to gather up everything we've learned so far about sustainability from the first module, the Sturgeon readings on natural, through Diamond and everything we saw there a few modules back, and some new things that we can learn here today. The interesting thing is we can learn new ways of reading sustainability from this essay on human rights, but we could also apply what we've seen so far and say, hey, those issues we've learned about, these people are talking about the same thing. And of course, maybe they're adding something as well. But I thought before we did that, I would just have fun. I was reading the paper a minute ago on the day I'm making this video and show you just how prevalent all of these ideas are. Here is basically the front page, at least digitally speaking, of the New York Times. Look at the front page, we can see right here, aligns perfectly with our course. Trump administration hardens its attack on climate science. So the U.S. government actually discrediting scientific research in a report that came out recently because of the short-term interests, the coal-fired power plants that override long-term interests like ecosystem security, slowing down climate change, right? So we see one here. Here's an interesting one. This is a brief opinion essay. Dear candidates, here's what black people want, and it says something we've talked about before. If you define people as natural or lesser than, they aren't part of the power structure. Few campaigns treat us as if our experiences matter, right? So the experiences of the marginalized are not really taken into consideration. I mean, there's lots of things we could look at if we went through here. Here's one on temporary employment overriding long-term full-time employment. So that's an issue of sustainability, right? Another interesting one, African millennials turn to farming, hoping to change minds and fortunes. So, of course, this is the developing world, producing their agriculture, doing so through Western means, which, you know, has sometimes gotten a bad rap in our course, but it can be good as well. We do see the use of technology down there, so this is not what we imagine maybe when we think of African sustenance farming, but this is modern farming that you would normally see in the developed world in many ways. And of course that could help a lot, but also could bring some problems with it that are unforeseen. These are fossil burning things, right? But at the same time, it can increase food production and increase the sustainability and the amount of people that an acre of land can feed. So all these things are going on, but you can just see where our course applies. Here's the agricultural component. Remains to be seen if they're going to have their own silent spring, and in 30 years they'll be putting chemicals on their crops, or if they'll go organic or find other ways to deal with pests, etc. Right? But we can see just a simple scroll through the paper. And there were many more that I found as I went through here. Here's an interesting one right here. Instead of synthesizing new biochemicals from scratch, the Nobel-winning chemist puts nature to the task. So this has to do with biotechnology and engineering new forms of life, right? So we can see this course takes us everywhere and is really in the news. And this is where I want you as well to be able to read all these things and have an opinion and see what's going on. All right, let's take a look at our human rights essay. Here's what we're interested in. These get to your D2L questions and just a way to finish out our course here as we near the end. We want to read this for connections to sustainability. What past ideas from the course do we see in these essays, but what new things do we see that we can also use to further our own analysis of how something is sustainable. Now, a lot of this is going to have to do with social justice, something that comes out of Module 2.1 initially, right? Stereotypes that limit people, definitions that limit people, and that therein cause environmental problems potentially, right? So that's what we're looking for. We might look for the environmental end. We might think of, you know, resources, food, water, etc. Even though there's not quite as much of that in there, some of it's implied. And then marginalization of people and the problems that that might create for the world. So more social justice, which leads to economic problems, community problems, educational problems, gender discrimination problems, these types of things. So we'll take a look at Atwood. We didn't read any Atwood in the course, but she's got some really, really great science fiction writing on climate change. Her famous book is The Handmaid's Tale, which you might know of, and which is made into a TV series as well that was pretty popular. So Atwood, just give you an overview, talks about women's reproductive rights, if you remember this. And it's kind of funny in pointing out some of the absurd things that have actually happened in the statements that have been made about women's reproductive rights. But what can we learn briefly? She talks about rights versus responsibilities, right? The right to personhood and equality versus the responsibility of simply being a child bearer. Here we're thrown back into sort of the conundrum of Eve. Eve is seen as a nurturer in many ways, but also she takes the blame and for Adam's failings, right? And also she is the childbearer too. So her nurturance that connects her with nature and her ability to reproduce life is also the reason she's discriminated against and seen as lesser than, right? And so we're still talking about this same thing 2,000 years later or more, I suppose, right? The rights versus responsibilities. Is she an equal, or the fact that she has this quality that allows for nurturance also allows her to be discriminated against? And we see that basic divide sort of inflected in all of the political discussion that Atwood brings up here. So what else do we see too, or what else might I add to this? This would be important in the developing world. It's worth pointing out we don't really read about it much, and you may know this already, but birth rates are much higher in the developing and underdeveloped worlds. But here's the interesting fact that maybe you don't know. The more education that a girl or woman has, we can even just say girls really in the underdeveloped or developing world, the lower their birth rate will be, and they'll have their first baby later. And there's a lot of really good research out there in that, if that pertains to your field. And we could think that in the U.S. too, people who have, children in high school, women who have children in high school, less chance of graduating high school, less chance of going to college, going to have more economic struggles, less opportunity to be in maybe a full functioning equal relationship, right, with their partner. And so this idea of rights and responsibilities and being a person versus being a child bearer is really important in the developing world too. Even the difference between having an 8th grade education versus a 4th grade education in underdeveloped countries really makes a world of difference in these young girls' lives. And so that isn't spoken of here. This focus is basically on the U.S., but you can see that played out across the world. And you can see when you start to have larger families and social inequality, that leads to extreme poverty in underdeveloped or developing countries and really harms the children, starts to harm the larger community, and becomes unsustainable, right? So this basic idea of reproductive rights, important in the U.S. as a right, but connected much more to educational opportunities and to resource usage and these types of things in underdeveloped or developing countries. The other thing that comes up in the essay is sort of a misunderstanding of biology. And it would seem that just a low scientific literacy of women's bodies or the human bodies also connects to sustainability. And in that way, it isn't so different than what McKibben will talk about in his section. We need to see ourselves not as just a political entity or a cultural entity with these legalities sort of given to us, what we can do and can't do with our bodies, or the limits on our identity and who we are according to our race or our gender. But rather, we need to start to think of ourselves as biological, and this is what we're given, and we better understand what our bodies are and what they need, not just for reproductive rights, but that same argument will be used that McKibben will use that same argument down here, that we ignore the biggest problem, that we need a healthy environment to survive, and that in some way that's a precedent to some of the other political and legal and cultural issues, right? So if we went through here, Atwood gives this example from a Republican from a few years back that says that when a woman is raped, her body shuts down so she can't get pregnant, which is, of course, not true. We all know, right? But you can see that this low level of scientific literacy in someone who's making laws creates problems, right? So this is a call for scientific literacy, particularly here for women's rights, for all the reasons I outlined. Let's go to McKibben. McKibben gives us a bunch of ideas that hopefully sounded familiar to you. Here are some that I saw inside of McKibben. He shows why we're bad at slow trends. That sounds a lot like Diamond. He says for thousands of years, the environment was a backdrop, right? And now suddenly it is not a backdrop anymore, and we see that we're changing it. He talks about progress, which is technological and political, has made us focus on humans, human problems, these types of things, but that we've overlooked environmental problems because of that. And he brings up war and germs and our susceptibility to hate and anger and these type of things. And they all needed to be ironed out as we advanced as humans into new systems. But now it's time to come back to the environment, especially with climate change, right? He mentioned Silent Spring right here. I hope you all had a moment where you thought, hey, I'm a part of this club. I know environmental history. That's part of what this course is, right? So I said, do you feel like a member of the I Know My American Environmental History Club? This should all look familiar to you. And maybe a few weeks ago you didn't know about these things, or just had a brief understanding of them. And now you're part of the club, right? So that's really cool in itself. You're part of this conversation. So here's a new way of reading sustainability that we might take from McKibben. The powerful are most likely to deny problems. An example would be the fossil fuel industry, which denies the problems, even comes up with faulty research sometimes, or underdeveloped research to prove that, or just hides research that they have showing that the pollution they produce is a problem, right? Their argument is usually we are only meeting human needs. And so if they change anything, suddenly we can't meet human needs, which isn't true necessarily. What it does is just perpetuates their system, which makes a lot of profit, or they simply don't want to change, right? That's kind of a human thing to do, and organizations change slow. But the implication is we can't change anything, or the world and our systems will fall apart. And so that's not helpful when we think about addressing the problems of the future. But so a new way of reading sustainability would be looking for moments when the powerful say, we can't change or we won't meet human needs anymore, which, is not potentially true, but that is the argument that is made. All right, so that would be a new thing to add to your arsenal for evaluating sustainability. So big picture, McKibben is arguing that people require a human right protecting them as a biological organism that needs healthy, livable air, water, food, and a secure environment, which could eventually include education, employment, rights, as we saw in all the other essays. So we don't think of ourselves as a biological entity, and that makes environmentalism and the environment a back burner issue, and we worry about other things more. That sounds a lot like Diamond, right? That it's just one of many issues. The environment is one of many issues, and we don't pay enough attention to it, even though it could be the primary issue to our biology, right? So, and one thing I might point out is the other essays in here kind of prove this true. Nearly everybody else is talking about political rights and technology and these type of things. And he's the only one that focuses on the environment with his time, right? If we look at Enright, it talks about women's rights, mainly freedom from abuse and abusive relationships, right? And so that's really interesting. And the connection to sustainability here would be that societies will have less social problems with less domestic abuse. You might be familiar with the research showing that people that come from abusive homes, say when they're children or wives or even men, not only do they have less human happiness, but they're usually less productive over their lifetime. There's a higher chance of mental illness, of other problems with their functionality, which harms them and limits them in some way from their potential. And of course, enough of that harms society as well, right? And so that becomes a problem. So that's where what seems like a women's issue actually becomes a larger issue for the community when you have a lot of these dysfunctional relationships happening in communities. All right, if we look at Bridle, really interesting essay. He's talking about technology. He opens with a lot of problems, some of them being environmental problems. Then we have technology that actually disguises, that cheats emissions tests. So that's an environmental problem. But he talks about other things too that relate to social justice, like YouTube's algorithms. We'll link you to if you can, and this is what this is saying if you were unclear what this meant. YouTube's algorithms for recommending a video to you. If you look at one, it'll recommend similar videos. So if you watch one on somebody who believes that the earth is flat or some other sort of conspiracy theory, it's going to link you with all the other conspiracy theories on YouTube that are similar. And pretty soon you've watched enough of them that you're susceptible to the message. And suddenly you have a really fairly awful, non-scientific, non-modern set of beliefs, right? And he says this is true for anything. Ultranationalists would be talking about white supremacists, right? And so if you can find one video, you'll find a lot more, and that this is where hate comes from. So the big picture here links to social justice, but also something else that's come up in our course, and that is we see technology as a form of progress, but technology comes with lots of unintended side effects. And we could read Bridle as outlining all those unintended side effects. Some of them have their problems based in the environment, many based in social justice. Happens when something like hate winds up on the internet. This is a social justice and rights issue. we feel alienated from them. Hate is increased, fear is increased, conspiracy theories increase, right? And so we need to be careful with all of this because, as we know, once communities are marginalized or stereotyped, then we can start to see environmental problems as well. They are the lesser people, and they will suffer more of our society's problems.